This month marks the 50th anniversary of the so-called Manson family murders, for which the famous, the infamous, and the notorious Charles Manson was ultimately tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison. He died in prison a couple of years ago. But because of the anniversary, there's renewed interest in looking back at the crimes. One piece of renewed interest is a series of interviews, which made it into a book and a film conducted by James Buddy Day. He's going to join us in a moment, but first, a look at some of his work.
There's no television, no newspapers, no magazines.
There was no electricity. There was no books. There were no calendars. There were no intellectual debates in the air. It was just the girls participating in preparing the meal.
The isolation helped. Manson, he knew that.
It wasn't as if he was telling people what to do and being bossy and commanding. He'd ask questions like, what do you think about this? Should we do this? He'd bring you into it. And then if you agreed, then you were like giving your word, you would do it. But you didn't think that you were being told what to do.
Though the women were providing for Manson, he convinced them that he was the one providing for them.
By that time, it had been about a year's worth of absolutely believing that Charlie knew everything and that my only safety was to stay with him and everybody.
I had to have a feeling of safety. Safety has always been a big issue with me.
It was gradual, and by the time it had become a totalitarian community, they no longer could challenge him. They had no perspective.
That is the work of filmmaker and author James Buddy Day, who joins us now live here on the Law and Crime Network. James, good to see you this afternoon.
Thanks for having me. Hey.
Okay, so this all started with you basically sending a letter to the notorious Charles Manson behind prison walls just to see if he would call you, and he actually picked up the phone and called you. Take us through that scenario. What did you learn?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. I learned an incredible amount. You know, Manson, I'd heard this kind of idea that Manson believed himself to be innocent. So that started a year-long process of me digging into the case, confronting him, talking to all the members of the Manson family to try and suss out this idea that he may or may not be guilty, which to me was an incredible idea that the most evil person in the world, the man who's literally the shorthand for evil, may have some degree of innocence in his history.
So that's where it started, and I hate to ask this because I deflect a lot of times when people ask me this question, but I'm going to ask you, ultimately, do you think he was innocent?
Ultimately, I think he was not morally innocent of the crimes. He was absolutely the catalyst for those murders. But I really do believe that the prosecution, the Los Angeles district attorney, fabricated a narrative in order to make his conduct criminal under the law. So that, and back in 1969, they had this incredible problem. They had this movie star who had been killed, an incredibly famous case, a crazy public who was panic-stricken. And when they arrested Manson, they had to put him behind bars, but they couldn't find a way to legally convict him. So they did create this kind of false narrative that's become the Manson mythology to convict him. And to me, that's the most interesting part.
So do you think that your book and your film ultimately clears that up for people who are trying to look back at this case this many years later?
I mean, the book and the film took years to curate and to write, and I think it does add to the narrative, and it does tell an untold story, a unique perspective into the Manson family murders that I think will shock and surprise most people.
Certainly, certainly. Okay, and with my own experience with similar types of films as this, the narrative societally has changed so much in the last 50 years. There is increased focus and increased skepticism at the narratives spun by prosecutors because, look, we've seen cases here on Law and Crime. I've seen cases as a journalist. You certainly have seen cases, I'm sure, where the narrative makes sense in court, but when it's compared to what's actually going on out on the streets, at least for journalists who walk the streets on some of these big cases, there are just parts of it that seem like they're a bit of a stretch sometimes. Is that basically what you're saying happened here?
Yeah, I think in terms of law and crime, I think what I see as a true crime professional, essentially, is that oftentimes you have prosecutors who are noble in their intent and detectives and police who are noble in their intent, but the evidence isn't always there. So you get scenarios where there's a noble conspiracy, where they create or fabricate a narrative in order to achieve a desirable goal. And that's what we saw in the Manson case. And again, it wasn't that Manson was some sort of patsy. It wasn't that he was completely morally innocent. He had nothing to do with the murders. He had a lot to do with them, but they couldn't convict him with the evidence they had. So they had to create evidence. And it's akin to planting drugs on a drug dealer. And it raises some serious and interesting questions about the justice system, because what we know is that the justice system is not about finding truth. It's adversarial on purpose, and that often leads to what they call the facts of the case that aren't actually facts. And when you often dig into these cases, you will find that prosecutors are looking for convictions and aren't necessarily concerned with what actually happened, with the truth of the matter, as I'm sure you found.
Okay, so you're talking about legal culpability and moral culpability. So what, in your opinion, did Manson specifically do, and what did he specifically not do?
Well, specifically, he certainly contributed to the murders in a sense that he knew about them, but he didn't. Under California law, you have to engage in an overt act. You have to do something very specific in furtherance of a crime to be found guilty of it. And that was the problem, especially when it comes to the Sharon Tate murders, which are the most famous of the Manson murders. Manson didn't actually do anything overt. He never said the words, "go and kill these people." He didn't drive them to the residence. He didn't go inside. He definitely implied that it would be okay if they were killed. And in his own way, he was complicit, but under the law, he didn't do that thing, he didn't take that concrete step that they needed to find him guilty.
Is it your opinion that he shouldn't have been convicted?
I think it's my opinion that he definitely didn't receive a fair trial, especially in the Sharon Tate murders. There's 9 murders in the Manson family spree of murders. And he definitely did things in the other murders that would make him guilty under the felony murder rule, in that he did something, he committed a felony that resulted in a murder. But in the Sharon Tate murder specifically, it's hard to see under the law what he actually did to overtly contribute to to those Understood. And that's where the prosecution came up with the whole helter-skelter narrative and argued that under civil law, he would be very vicariously responsible for the murders because of his ideology.
And James, we have less than a minute left. I know that a lot of your process here journalistically was trying to get inside the mind of Manson. In less than 30 seconds, can you take us there?
I don't know that I can take you inside Charles Manson's mind in 30 seconds, but I think the biggest thing that people misunderstand about him is that he was just a reflection of everything that he saw. He really had no master manipulator mind control abilities. What he would do is whatever you brought to him, he'd spit that back at you, and that would make him seem insightful. And that was really his trick all along.
James Buddy Day talking to us about the Charles Manson case 50 years ago this month. Filmmaker and author. I look forward to watching the film, definitely. The beginning of the book is excellent. Thank you so much for joining us here on Law and Crime.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back with more here on the Law and Crime Network after this break, so stick around. A lot more trial coverage is coming your way.